Sarah Martinez had always been different from other soldiers. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing just over 100 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a military recruit. When she first walked into the Army recruitment office, in her small Texas town, the sergeant behind the desk actually laughed. He thought she was there to pick up her boyfriend or maybe ask for directions. The year was 2003, and the military was desperate for new recruits. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were demanding more soldiers than ever before. Still, when Sarah raised her right hand and swore to defend her country, whispers followed her everywhere she went. Other recruits towered over her during basic training. Drill sergeants had to adjust equipment to fit her small frame. Even her combat boots had to be special ordered because the standard sizes were too big. During physical training, Sarah struggled with tasks that seemed easy for others. Carrying a full military backpack was like hauling a refrigerator on her shoulders. The weight of her rifle and gear made her stumble during long marches. Other soldiers often had to help her climb over obstacles during training courses. Some of her fellow recruits started calling her tiny behind her back, though not necessarily in a mean way. Her instructors watched her with concern. Military life was brutal and combat was even worse. They had seen plenty of big, strong soldiers break under pressure. What chance did this small woman have in a real battle? Captain Williams, her company commander, pulled her aside one day after a particularly difficult training exercise. He spoke gently but firmly about the realities of military service and suggested she might be better suited for a support role, far from the front lines. Sarah's family back home shared these concerns. Her mother called every week, begging her to quit and come home. Her father, a veteran himself, understood her desire to serve but worried about her safety. Her younger brother joked that she should be the one protected, not doing the protecting. Even her high school friends couldn't understand why someone so small would choose such a dangerous path. But Sarah had something that couldn't be measured in height or weight. She had an iron determination that had carried her through a difficult childhood. Growing up in a poor neighborhood, she had learned to fight for everything she wanted. She studied harder than anyone else to get good grades. She worked 2 jobs to help her family pay bills. When bullies picked on smaller kids at school, she always stepped in to help, even when it meant facing bigger opponents. The military training was the hardest thing she had ever done, but Sarah refused to quit. When she couldn't do 10 push-ups, she practiced until she could do 20. When long marches left her exhausted, she signed up for extra training runs. She studied military tactics late into the night, memorizing everything about weapons, strategy, and battlefield medicine. She knew she had to be twice as good as everyone else just to be considered equal. Slowly, some of her fellow soldiers began to respect her dedication. They saw her getting up at dawn for extra training sessions. They watched her help struggling recruits with their studies even though she was fighting her own battles. Her small size became less important as her knowledge and determination grew. She earned expert marksman badges and top scores in tactical planning exercises. After completing basic training and advanced courses, Sarah was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. This was one of the Army's elite units known for being first into dangerous situations. Even here, the doubts continued. Some soldiers questioned whether she could handle the physical demands of airborne operations. Jumping out of aircraft with full combat gear was challenging even for experienced paratroopers. The division was preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, where they would face real combat for the first time. Sarah spent months training for mountain warfare, learning to fight in harsh conditions at high altitude. She practiced medical procedures that could save lives in battle. She studied the enemy's tactics and the terrain where they would be fighting. Despite all her preparation, many people still believed she was too fragile for what lay ahead. On the day before deployment, Sarah called her family one last time. Her mother was crying. Her father was proud but worried, and her brother made her promise to stay safe. She packed her gear carefully, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment. Her rifle, cleaned and maintained to perfection, would soon be tested in real combat. The small-town girl who everyone said was too fragile for battle was about to prove them all wrong. The airplane engines roared as Sarah's unit flew toward Afghanistan in the early months of 2004. She sat squeezed between 2 much larger soldiers. her gear packed tightly around her feet. The flight lasted 18 hours with stops for fuel in different countries. Nobody talked much during the journey. Everyone was thinking about what waited for them in the mountains of Afghanistan. When they finally landed at Bagram Air Base, the heat hit them like a wall, despite the early morning hour. Sarah had trained in hot weather before, but this was different. The air was thin because of the high altitude, making it hard to breathe. Dust covered everything, and the smell of diesel fuel and burning trash filled the air. This was her first time in a war zone, and it felt like stepping onto another planet. The base was massive, with thousands of soldiers from different countries. Helicopters flew overhead constantly, carrying supplies and soldiers to remote outposts scattered throughout the mountains. Sarah's unit was assigned to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, a small outpost near the Pakistani border. This area was known for frequent attacks by Taliban fighters who crossed back and forth across the border. The helicopter ride to FOB Phoenix was Sarah's first real taste of danger. The aircraft flew low and fast through mountain valleys, the pilot constantly changing direction to avoid possible enemy fire. Sarah looked out the window at the rugged landscape below. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, with small villages tucked into valleys like islands in a sea of rock and sand. FOB Phoenix was much smaller than Bagram, with only about 200 soldiers. The base was surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire, and guard towers watched over the surrounding area day and night. Living conditions were basic, with soldiers sleeping in small tents or converted shipping containers. There was no air conditioning, limited electricity, and water was always in short supply. Sarah was assigned to Alpha Company, led by Captain Rodriguez, a tough veteran who had already served 2 tours in Iraq. When he first met Sarah, his expression was skeptical. He had specifically requested experienced soldiers for this dangerous assignment, and headquarters had sent him someone who looked like she belonged in high school. He assigned her to work with Sergeant Jackson, a respected soldier who could keep an eye on the new arrival. The first few weeks were an adjustment period for everyone. Sarah had to learn the daily routines of combat life while dealing with the challenges of her new environment. The altitude made physical tasks more difficult than during training. Simple activities like walking up hills left her breathing hard. The extreme temperature changes from scorching days to freezing nights were exhausting. Other soldiers in her unit remained polite but distant. They had their own concerns about staying alive in a hostile environment. Taking care of someone they saw as weak could get them all killed. Some openly questioned why the army would send someone so small to one of the most dangerous areas in Afghanistan. During patrol briefings, she noticed how some soldiers exchanged glances when assignments were discussed. Despite the cold reception, Sarah threw herself into learning everything about their mission. FOB Phoenix was responsible for protecting supply convoys and conducting patrols in nearby villages. The area was known for roadside bombs, sniper attacks, and ambushes by Taliban fighters. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy activity was increasing as winter approached. Sarah studied maps of the local area until she could navigate by memory. She learned the names and locations of every village, every road, and every known danger spot. She practiced with night vision equipment and communication devices until she could operate them perfectly in the dark. Most importantly, she spent hours at the firing range becoming familiar with every weapon in their arsenal. Her dedication began to earn grudging respect from some soldiers. Sergeant Jackson noticed that Sarah never complained about difficult assignments or harsh conditions. She volunteered for extra duties and always had her equipment ready for action. She also showed genuine interest in learning from experienced soldiers, asking thoughtful questions about tactics and battlefield procedures. The real test came during her first patrol outside the base. Sarah's squad was assigned to escort a supply convoy through a particularly dangerous valley, known for ambushes. As they prepared to leave, Captain Rodriguez pulled her aside for a private conversation. He explained that this was not a training exercise and that people could die if anyone made mistakes. He asked if she was absolutely certain she was ready for combat. Sarah looked directly at the captain and said she was ready to do whatever was necessary. She had trained for this moment for over a year, and she was not going to let her team down. The captain studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. He told her to stay close to Sergeant Jackson and follow his lead exactly. As the convoy rolled out of the base that morning, Sarah felt her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The mountains around them were beautiful but dangerous, hiding enemies who wanted to kill them. She checked her rifle one more time and took a deep breath. Her real test as a soldier was about to begin. The convoy moved slowly through the mountain pass, engines straining against the steep grade. Sarah sat in the back of an armored vehicle, scanning the rocky slopes for any sign of movement. Her hands were steady on her rifle, but her stomach churned with nervous energy. This was her first combat patrol, and everyone around her seemed calm while she felt like her heart might explode. The road they traveled was barely wide enough for their vehicles. On one side rose a steep cliff face, and on the other dropped a deep valley that seemed to fall forever. Local intelligence had warned them about this particular route. Taliban fighters often positioned themselves on the high ground, waiting for convoys to enter the narrow pass where escape would be impossible. Sergeant Jackson sat across from Sarah, his experienced eyes constantly moving between his radio and the landscape outside. He had been through this area dozens of times and knew every potential hiding spot. When he noticed Sarah's tense posture, he leaned over and spoke quietly. He reminded her to breathe normally and trust her training. The key to survival, he said, was staying alert without panicking. About halfway through the pass, the lead vehicle suddenly stopped. The radio crackled with urgent voices reporting a possible roadside bomb ahead. Sarah felt her mouth go dry as she watched soldiers jump out of vehicles and take defensive positions. This was exactly the kind of situation they had trained for. But reality felt completely different from practice exercises. The bomb disposal team moved forward carefully to investigate the suspicious object on the road. Everyone else waited in tense silence, knowing that enemy fighters might be watching from the surrounding hills. If this was an ambush, the bomb would explode just as attackers opened fire from multiple directions. Sarah gripped her rifle tighter and tried to remember everything she had learned about combat tactics. After 20 long minutes, the disposal team gave the all-clear signal. The suspicious object turned out to be debris from a previous explosion, not a new bomb. The convoy began moving again, but everyone remained on high alert. False alarms were common, but they could also be tricks designed to make soldiers relax their guard before a real attack. As they continued through the mountains, Sarah began to understand why this assignment was considered so dangerous. The terrain gave every advantage to attackers while making defense almost impossible. Radio communication was spotty because of the mountains. Air support would take too long to arrive if they got into trouble. They were essentially on their own in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Her first patrol ended without incident, but Sarah could see the stress on everyone's faces when they returned to base. Living with constant danger was exhausting, even for experienced soldiers. Captain Rodriguez debriefed the team, reviewing what went well and what could be improved. He made no specific comments about Sarah's performance, which she took as a good sign. Over the following weeks, Sarah participated in more patrols and gradually became familiar with the rhythm of combat operations. She learned to read the landscape like experienced soldiers, spotting potential hiding places and ambush sites. Her small size actually became an advantage in some situations, allowing her to take cover behind rocks and barriers that couldn't protect larger soldiers. The turning point in how others saw her came during a patrol to a remote village, where they were investigating reports of Taliban activity. The village elder was suspicious of American soldiers and refused to provide information. Sarah noticed that the man kept glancing nervously at a specific building. When she mentioned this observation to Sergeant Jackson, he realized she was right to be suspicious. Further investigation revealed that the building contained weapons and communication equipment used by Taliban fighters. The discovery led to several arrests and prevented a planned attack on another convoy. Captain Rodriguez praised Sarah's attention to detail during the mission debriefing. Other soldiers began to see that her careful observation skills were valuable assets to the team. As autumn turned to winter, fighting in the area intensified. Taliban groups were trying to establish control over key mountain passes before heavy snow made travel impossible. Intelligence reports indicated that a major attack was being planned against FOB Phoenix itself. The base commander increased security measures and prepared for a possible siege. Sarah's unit was assigned to man one of the guard towers during the night shift. This was considered a crucial position because it overlooked the main approach route to the base. Previous attacks had often begun with attempts to breach the perimeter in this area. The assignment showed that Captain Rodriguez now trusted Sarah with important responsibilities. During one particularly cold night in late November, Sarah was on guard duty with two other soldiers when motion sensors detected movement outside the perimeter. Through night vision equipment, they could see shadowy figures moving among the rocks about 400 yards from the base. The figures were trying to stay hidden, but their movement patterns suggested they were conducting reconnaissance for a future attack. Sarah immediately reported the sighting to the base command center, while her fellow soldiers prepared their weapons. The base went to high alert status with all soldiers moving to defensive positions. This could be the beginning of the major attack that intelligence had predicted. Sarah felt her training take over as she focused her attention on the approaching threat. What happened next would change everything about how her fellow soldiers saw her. The small woman they had once considered too fragile for combat was about to face the ultimate test of battlefield courage. The enemy was coming, and she would have to prove that size had nothing to do with a warrior's heart. The attack came at dawn, just as the sun began to paint the mountains in shades of orange and red. Sarah had been on guard duty for 6 hours when the first rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the sky and exploded against the base's outer wall. The blast shook the guard tower and sent chunks of concrete flying through the air. Within seconds, the peaceful morning erupted into chaos. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on 3 sides of the base, using the rocky terrain to hide their advance during the night. They had chosen their timing perfectly, attacking during the shift change when some soldiers were still waking up and others were exhausted from overnight duties. The base's alarm sirens wailed as automatic weapons fire began raking the perimeter walls. Sarah's position in Tower 3 gave her a clear view of the main assault force approaching from the east. Through her rifle scope, she could count at least 20 enemy fighters moving forward in small groups, using boulders and old military vehicles for cover. They were well organized and clearly experienced in mountain warfare, advancing with disciplined fire and movement tactics. The base's defensive plan called for Tower 3 to provide covering fire for soldiers manning the eastern wall. Sarah and her 2 fellow guards, Corporal Martinez and Private Johnson, were supposed to work together to slow the enemy advance. But within the first few minutes of fighting, an enemy sniper's bullet found Corporal Martinez, sending him crashing to the tower floor with a serious shoulder wound. Private Johnson, who had arrived at the base just 2 weeks earlier, froze when he saw the blood spreading across Martinez's uniform. The young soldier had never been in real combat before, and the violence of the attack overwhelmed his training. He crouched behind the tower's protective barriers, unable to return fire effectively. Sarah realized that she was now essentially alone in defending the tower's sector. The radio crackled with urgent reports from around the base. Tower 1 was taking heavy fire and requesting support. The motor pool had been hit by rockets and several vehicles were burning. The command center reported that this was a coordinated attack by at least 60 enemy fighters, the largest assault on FOB Phoenix since it was established. All available soldiers were needed at their defensive positions. Sarah quickly assessed her situation while bullets sparked off the tower's metal framework around her. She had limited ammunition, 1 wounded soldier who needed medical attention, and 1 soldier who was too scared to fight effectively. The enemy was advancing steadily toward the base's eastern wall, and her tower was the only thing providing covering fire for the defenders below. Drawing on her months of training and study, Sarah began to systematically engage the attacking fighters. She had always been an excellent marksman, and now those skills became crucial for survival. Her rifle cracked repeatedly as she picked off enemy fighters who exposed themselves while advancing. Each shot was carefully aimed, making every bullet count since ammunition was limited. The Taliban fighters quickly realized that effective fire was coming from Tower 3 and began concentrating their attack on Sarah's position. Bullets whined overhead and shattered sandbags around her firing position. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded just below the tower, showering her with debris and leaving her ears ringing. But she continued firing, forcing the enemy to take cover and slowing their advance. As the battle raged, Sarah noticed that the enemy was trying to flank the base by moving through a dry creek bed that provided natural cover. If they succeeded in reaching the creek bed, they would be able to attack the eastern wall from an unexpected angle. The soldiers defending that section wouldn't see them coming until it was too late. Sarah tried to radio a warning to the command center, but her communications equipment had been damaged by shrapnel from the earlier rocket attack. She could hear radio chatter from other positions but couldn't transmit her own messages. She was on her own with critical information that could save lives. Making a split-second decision that would define her military career, Sarah left her protected position in the tower and began moving toward a better vantage point where she could engage the flanking force. This meant exposing herself to enemy fire while crossing open ground, something that violated basic survival principles. But she could see that the base's defenders were unaware of the approaching threat. As she moved across the compound, enemy bullets kicked up dust around her feet. Her small size worked in her favor as she sprinted between buildings and dove behind protective barriers. Other soldiers saw her moving under fire and assumed she was running away from the fighting. Some shouted for her to get back to her position, not understanding what she was attempting to do. Sarah reached an elevated position near the eastern wall, just as the enemy flanking force emerged from the creek bed. They were less than 100 yards from the base's defensive line and preparing to attack the surprised defenders from behind. Sarah had maybe 30 seconds to act before the enemy would be in position to cause massive casualties among her fellow soldiers. Setting up her rifle on a pile of sandbags, Sarah began engaging the flanking force with rapid, accurate fire. Her position was completely exposed to enemy return fire, but she ignored the danger and focused on protecting her fellow soldiers. One by one, she picked off the enemy fighters who were about to attack the base from behind. The Taliban fighters, caught in the open without cover, were forced to retreat back toward the creek bed under Sarah's withering fire. Her intervention had saved the eastern defensive line and possibly prevented the base from being overrun, but her exposed position made her a target for every enemy fighter within range. Enemy fire concentrated on Sarah's position as Taliban fighters realized she was disrupting their attack plan. Bullets smacked into the sandbags around her, sending sand spraying into her face and eyes. A sniper's shot barely missed her head, so close she felt the heat of the bullet as it passed by. Any reasonable person would have retreated to safety, but Sarah understood that withdrawing now would doom the soldiers she was protecting. The main assault force was still advancing on the eastern wall, but slowly now because Sarah's accurate fire was keeping them pinned down behind cover. Every time an enemy fighter tried to move forward, her rifle would crack and force them back. She had become the anchor point for the entire eastern defense, a role no one had expected her to fill when the attack began. From her exposed position, Sarah could see the bigger picture of the battle unfolding around the base. The northern and western walls were also under heavy attack, with Taliban fighters using mortars and rocket-propelled grenades to try to breach the defenses. Thick black smoke rose from several burning buildings inside the compound. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the surrounding mountains like deadly thunder. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio, calling for all units to report their status. Sarah could hear the strain in his voice as he tried to coordinate the defense while under intense enemy fire. Tower 1 reported heavy casualties. The motor pool was completely destroyed. Medical personnel were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers. The situation was desperate, and everyone knew it. Sarah's ammunition was running dangerously low. She had started the battle with 200 rounds and was down to her last 30 bullets. Each shot now had to count more than ever, but the enemy seemed to have unlimited ammunition and was firing constantly at her position. Sandbags around her were torn apart by repeated hits, providing less and less protection. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. Air support was finally arriving, but would it be enough to turn the tide of battle? The helicopters would need time to assess the situation and coordinate their attack runs. Meanwhile, the ground assault continued with unrelenting intensity. A Taliban fighter armed with a rocket-propelled grenade had worked his way to within 200 yards of Sarah's position. She could see him preparing to fire directly at her, which would almost certainly be fatal at such close range. With only seconds to act, Sarah aimed carefully and fired one of her remaining bullets. The shot found its target, and the enemy fighter collapsed before he could launch his deadly rocket. The successful shot saved her life, but it also revealed her exact position to other enemy fighters. Within moments, concentrated fire from multiple directions began tearing apart her defensive position. Chunks of concrete and metal flew through the air as bullets and grenade fragments shredded everything around her. She was completely pinned down and unable to return fire effectively. That's when something unexpected happened. Other soldiers around the base began to understand what Sarah had been doing. They realized she had been holding the eastern flank almost single-handedly, while exposed to enemy fire from all directions. Word spread quickly through the defensive positions that the small soldier everyone had doubted was keeping them all alive. Sergeant Jackson led a group of soldiers in a coordinated movement to support Sarah's position. They provided covering fire that allowed her to reload and continue engaging the enemy. For the first time since the attack began, Sarah felt like she was part of a team effort rather than fighting alone. The other soldiers had finally seen her true capabilities under fire. The arriving helicopters began their attack runs, targeting enemy positions with rockets and machine gun fire. The Taliban fighters, caught in the open without air defense weapons, began falling back toward the mountains. But they continued firing as they retreated, determined to inflict maximum casualties before withdrawing completely. Sarah used the helicopter attacks as cover to advance toward the perimeter wall, where she could better support the defending soldiers. Her movement across the compound drew renewed enemy fire, but she reached the wall safely and immediately began engaging Taliban fighters who were trying to escape. Her accurate shooting prevented several enemy fighters from reaching safety in the mountains. As the battle turned in favor of the defending forces, Sarah found herself fighting alongside soldiers who had previously questioned her abilities. They worked together to pursue the retreating enemy and secure the area around the base. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable. She was no longer the fragile newcomer, but a proven warrior who had earned their respect through courage under fire. The helicopter gunships continued their pursuit of the fleeing Taliban forces, forcing them deeper into the mountains where they could no longer threaten the base. Gradually, the sound of gunfire faded away, replaced by the voices of soldiers, calling out status reports and checking on wounded comrades. The attack had lasted nearly 3 hours, but Fob Phoenix had survived. Sarah slumped against the perimeter wall, exhausted from the intensity of combat. Her rifle was almost too hot to touch from rapid firing, and her hands were shaking from adrenaline. She had fired nearly all of her ammunition and couldn't remember exactly how many enemy fighters she had engaged. All she knew was that she had done everything possible to protect her fellow soldiers. Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her, his uniform torn and blackened with smoke. He looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. Not skepticism or concern, but genuine respect and admiration. He had watched her performance during the battle and realized that the army had sent him exactly the kind of soldier he needed, regardless of her size. The aftermath of battle revealed the true scale of what had happened at Fob Phoenix. Intelligence officers later determined that the Taliban had planned this attack for months, gathering nearly 80 fighters from multiple groups across the region. It was intended to be a decisive victory that would force American forces to abandon the strategically important base. Instead, the attack had failed completely, with enemy forces suffering heavy casualties while achieving none of their objectives. Medical teams worked frantically to treat wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict. The base hospital was overwhelmed with casualties, forcing medical personnel to set up treatment areas in any available space. Sarah helped carry wounded soldiers to medical stations, her small size allowing her to maneuver quickly through damaged buildings and debris-filled corridors. Among the wounded was Corporal Martinez, who had been shot early in the battle while serving alongside Sarah in Tower 3. His shoulder wound was serious but not life-threatening, and he would eventually make a full recovery. As medics treated his injury, Martinez told everyone who would listen about Sarah's incredible performance during the attack. According to Martinez, Sarah had essentially defended Tower 3 alone after he was wounded, and Private Johnson became unable to fight effectively. She had maintained accurate fire against superior numbers, while calling out target information to other defensive positions. Most importantly, she had spotted and disrupted the enemy flanking movement that could have resulted in the base being overrun. Word of Sarah's actions spread quickly throughout Fob Phoenix and beyond. Battle damage assessment teams confirmed that she had been responsible for stopping at least 15 enemy fighters, including several who were in positions to cause massive casualties among the defending forces. Her decision to leave the relative safety of the guard tower to engage the flanking force was being called one of the most courageous acts of the entire battle. Captain Rodriguez submitted a detailed report about the battle to higher command, specifically highlighting Sarah's performance under fire. He wrote that she had displayed exceptional courage, tactical awareness, and marksmanship skills that had been crucial to the successful defense of the base. He recommended her for immediate promotion and formal recognition of her heroic actions. The transformation in how other soldiers treated Sarah was immediate and dramatic. The same people who had whispered about her being too small and fragile now sought her out to shake her hand and thank her personally. Experienced veterans who had initially been skeptical of her abilities now asked for her opinions on tactics and defensive positions. Sergeant Jackson, who had been assigned to watch over Sarah when she first arrived, publicly admitted that he had been wrong about her capabilities. During a company meeting, he told everyone that Sarah had shown more courage in one battle than most soldiers displayed in an entire deployment. He said he would be honored to serve alongside her in any future operations. Even Private Johnson, who had frozen during his first combat experience, came to apologize to Sarah for not supporting her better during the battle. She responded with understanding and kindness, explaining that everyone reacts differently to combat, and that his response was more common than people realized. She offered to help him prepare for future situations, showing the same mentorship that others had provided for her. News of the battle reached Sarah's family back home through official military channels. Her parents received a phone call from Captain Rodriguez himself, who explained that their daughter had performed heroically during a major enemy attack. He assured them that Sarah was uninjured and had likely saved many American lives through her actions. Her mother cried with relief and pride, while her father felt vindicated in his belief that his daughter could handle whatever challenges the military. Presented military journalists arrived at FOB Phoenix to interview soldiers about the battle and document the successful defense of the base. When they learned about Sarah's role in the fighting, she became the focus of several news stories that were eventually published in military magazines and newspapers back home. The headlines told the story of a small-town woman who had proven that courage came in all sizes. Sarah herself remained modest about her actions during the battle. When interviewed by journalists, she insisted that she had simply done her job and followed her training. She emphasized that the successful defense had been a team effort involving every soldier at the base. She gave credit to her instructors, fellow soldiers, and the air support crews who had helped turn the tide of battle. Despite her modesty, Sarah's reputation spread throughout the military community in Afghanistan. Other units requested her assistance with training exercises and tactical planning sessions. Base commanders wanted soldiers like her assigned to their most dangerous outposts. She had become living proof that determination and skill mattered more than physical size in combat situations. The Taliban forces that had attacked FOB Phoenix never attempted another major assault on the base. Intelligence reports suggested that the failed attack had been so costly in terms of casualties and lost equipment that enemy commanders decided the base was too well defended to be worth attacking again. Sarah's heroic stand had not only saved lives during the battle, but had also provided long-term security for everyone stationed at the base. As winter settled over the mountains of Afghanistan, Sarah continued serving at FOB Phoenix with a new sense of confidence and purpose. She had faced the ultimate test of combat and proven herself capable of defending her fellow soldiers under the most difficult circumstances. The doubts and whispers that had followed her throughout training were now permanently silenced. The small woman who had been told she was too fragile for battle had become one of the most respected soldiers in her unit. Her transformation from doubted newcomer to proven warrior was complete, but her story was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, but Sarah now faced them with the knowledge that she belonged exactly where she was. 6 months after the battle that changed everything, Sarah found herself in a position she never could have imagined when she first arrived in Afghanistan. She had been promoted to sergeant and was now responsible for training new soldiers who arrived at FOB Phoenix. The same woman who had once needed extra help carrying her equipment was now teaching others how to survive in combat. Her training methods were unique because she understood what it felt like to be underestimated and doubted. When new soldiers arrived who seemed nervous or uncertain, Sarah took special care to build their confidence while pushing them to excel. She remembered how isolated she had felt during her early days at the base and made sure no one else had to experience that loneliness. One of her first students was a young soldier named Private Chen, who reminded Sarah of herself in many ways. Chen was small, quiet, and seemed overwhelmed by the harsh realities of military life in Afghanistan. Other soldiers had already started making jokes about whether Chen would be able to handle combat situations. Sarah recognized the pattern and intervened immediately. She spent extra time with Chen, teaching advanced marksmanship techniques and battlefield tactics. More importantly, she shared her own story of overcoming doubt and proving herself through determination and skill. Chen listened carefully to every word, understanding that she was learning from someone who had walked the same difficult path. Sarah's reputation extended far beyond FOB Phoenix. Military leaders throughout Afghanistan began requesting her input on defensive strategies and training programs. Her experience defending the base during the major Taliban attack had provided valuable lessons that could be applied to other dangerous outposts. She was invited to brief senior officers on tactics that small units could use when facing superior numbers. The story of her heroic stand had reached the highest levels of military command. General Morrison, the commanding officer for all American forces in the region, personally visited FOB Phoenix to meet Sarah and hear her account of the battle. He spent 2 hours discussing tactics and leadership with her, treating her opinions with the same respect he would show any experienced combat veteran. During the general's visit, he announced that Sarah was being awarded the Silver Star, one of the military's highest decorations for valor in combat. The citation specifically mentioned her courage in leaving a protected position to engage enemy forces who threatened to overrun the base's defenses. It also recognized her exceptional marksmanship and tactical awareness during the 3-hour battle. The award ceremony took place at Bagram Air Base, with hundreds of soldiers in attendance. Sarah's parents flew from Texas to witness their daughter receive one of the military's most prestigious honors. When her name was called and she stepped forward to receive the medal, the assembled soldiers erupted in sustained applause that lasted several minutes. Her mother later said that watching Sarah receive the Silver Star was the proudest moment of her life. She remembered the small girl who had always stood up for others despite being smaller than her opponents. Now that same determination and courage had been recognized at the highest levels of the American military. Her father, still emotional from the ceremony, told reporters that his daughter had always been tougher than she looked. After receiving the Silver Star, Sarah was offered several different assignments that would have taken her away from combat zones. She could have become an instructor at military schools back home, sharing her knowledge with new recruits in a safe environment. She could have taken staff positions where her tactical expertise would be valued, without the constant danger of enemy attack. Instead, Sarah chose to extend her deployment in Afghanistan and continue serving at FOB Phoenix. She felt a responsibility to the soldiers under her command and wanted to see them safely through their tours of duty. The base had become her home, and the people there had become her family. Leaving them seemed like abandoning her post when they still needed her experience and leadership. Her decision to stay surprised some people, but impressed many others. Military leaders understood that truly great soldiers were those who chose to serve others rather than seeking personal advancement. Sarah's willingness to remain in a dangerous assignment to help her fellow soldiers demonstrated the kind of character that made her exceptional. As her extended tour continued, Sarah continued developing new training techniques and defensive strategies. She established a mentorship program that paired experienced soldiers with newcomers, ensuring that everyone had someone to turn to for guidance and support. The program became so successful that other bases began implementing similar systems. Sarah also worked with military engineers to improve the defensive capabilities of FOB Phoenix. Her battlefield experience had shown her weaknesses in the base's design that could be corrected with relatively simple modifications. The improvements she suggested made the base significantly more defensible and reduced the risk to all soldiers stationed there. When Sarah finally completed her extended deployment and returned to the United States, she was assigned to the Army's training command at Fort Benning, Georgia. Her job was to develop new combat training programs based on lessons learned in Afghanistan and Iraq. She was particularly focused on preparing smaller soldiers for the physical and mental challenges of modern warfare. Years later, Sarah retired from the Army as a master sergeant, having served multiple combat tours and trained hundreds of soldiers. She had proven beyond any doubt that courage, determination, and skill were far more important than physical size in determining military success. The woman who had been told she was too fragile for battle had become one of the most respected soldiers of her generation. Today, Sarah works as a civilian contractor, continuing to train military personnel and law enforcement officers. She speaks regularly at military academies and training centers, sharing her story with new generations of soldiers. Her message is always the same. Never let anyone tell you that you're not capable of achieving your dreams, no matter what obstacles you face. The small-town girl who walked into a recruitment office and faced nothing but skepticism had transformed herself into a Silver Star recipient and respected military leader. Her story serves as inspiration for anyone who has ever been told they weren't strong enough, big enough, or tough enough to succeed. Sarah Martinez proved that the size of your heart matters far more than the size of your body.